I'm really delighted to welcome Stacey and Holly from the Newcastle City Team Commission to take the screen and present your work for the Newcastle City Team.
Very much, Susie. I'm just going to get this full screen and then we'll be on the road. That's still working for everyone, it seems to be. Apologies that it gets kind of cut off at the side. That seems to be a thing of using a kind of preview mode. Hi everyone, thanks so much for hosting us today and for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedules to come and talk about this. Our commission is called Donate My Body, Bequeath My Data. And it really explores concepts around ideas of what is the body, what is the role of the body, particularly within end-of-life practices. We have elements of a growing movement of death positivity in the world today. So people being really interested in this idea of how does the body link to nature? How do we become part of our life cycles again? How do we talk more about death? So concepts of death literacy as well. And my work revolves around some of these kind of really critical questions and understandings of how design, creativity, embodiment, and choice and ritual at the end of life sort of come together to help the public think about these things in new ways. We are obviously in a really challenging and interesting time period at the moment where we have a lot of death surrounding us. The visual representations of death during COVID are really interesting. So the kind of mass burials and mass obituaries within the newspaper. And I've got that article at the bottom, the discomfort of death counts. So the way that this kind of mass becomes something that really troubles us and creates this kind of rupture in society where we are much more open to thinking about death at the moment, I would say, from the conversations I've had with people, but don't really know what to do with that openness and don't know how to support others going through these challenging times at the moment. I'm also interested in narratives about what to do with our bodies and ourselves at the end of life. So this is a really interesting story. Susan Potter donated her body to science and was really keen at advocating that idea of being part of this bigger picture, essentially, literally turning her body inside out and being part of this approach to helping the human race understand what the body and the functions of the body are. I'm also really interested in the kind of apparatus around dying. So the way that in a hospital, in a hospice, or even in the home, we become transformed and connected to these technologies and almost become a part of those scientific apparatus and these systems in a way that clashes in some ways against what we might call now the new natural burial movement or the natural death movement. And on the right, we have the image from Recompose, which is a new center in Seattle that attempts to Susie?
Stacey, sorry, I just want to make sure that you know are you sharing correctly? Can you just make sure? I don't want you.
Sorry, sharing this. Is that right now? Are you guys on the right slides?
Oh, yes, we are now, I think.
And you can see as I move through the slides?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so this is about the structures of silence and about the body and nature and stuff, and the death counts and the kind of COVID stuff, and then Susan Potter's body. Sorry about that. And yeah, so on the right-hand side, we've got then the Recompose Center, which is a new center in Seattle that aims to transform the body into soil, into dirt, so that it can be planted for kind of woodland burials in cities. And so we have this really interesting juxtaposition between the highly scientific mode of dying and the kind of new natural order of death. And we cite this HCA commission really in between these two spaces, trying to see how people might imagine new forms of donation of their body to science and the way that that might become part of a new collective whole or a new collective idea of that donation process. My work historically has been working around concepts of choice and agency at the end of life, both around digital literacy and digital data. So what happens to our data after we die, but also in terms of how design is challenging and creating new types of choices that create new forms of ritual. So lots of collaborations with libraries, but also with hospitals, hospices, museums, festivals, and other sectors to try and explore how the public feel about these technological changes, and also looking speculatively at futures. So thinking about the way the technology For example, technology that allows you to have kind of tattooing on the bodies, and the way that those memorial tattoos that included ink in flesh might be in the future kind of technological versions which include memories in flesh. So these kinds of techno-future narratives are really of interest to me, and they really, the way that the public explore them and think about them is really of interest to me. Also elements of things like digital sarcophagus. So there are many companies that begin to help people think about how to preserve their digital legacies, and think about, you know, within the scientific realm, thinking about things like biodata and our willingness to give over the data that our body produces, whether that's a kind of the things that record your kind of movement when you're walking, like pedometers, or whether that's sleep information, or even whether that's more intimate information around kind of periods, or around masturbation, or anything like that, that kind of gets sent through as forms of data and exists in particular ways. There's some really interesting projects that we've been inspired from. So this is a Sabre and Mace, Mark Owens and Tolly Mulligan. They have this system around putting your avatar on virtual death row. So this is a kind of an environment called Second Life, which is a virtual world that many people engaged in quite deeply around the 2005 through to around 2008 was, I guess, the bulk time of that. And this was a way of kind of metaphorically letting your avatar sort of commit suicide and getting this kind of marker or memorial in the virtual space. And although it's quite different to what we're interested in doing, I like the idea of the visualization of the self and thinking about the way that we might incorporate or include that structure into the artist commission. We're also coming from myself and Holly as my invisible partner so far, who will jump in now, but myself and Holly are kind of coming from different backgrounds. So I'm coming from a design background, really interested in that communication language, and really interested in thinking about how design might contribute to these questions and dilemmas. And Holly can introduce herself and tell us the health background as well.
Okay, so I am a medical sociologist by background. And much of my previous research has been around kind of patient and clinicians' experiences around managing end of life, and about how our bodies and our identities are shaped by new medical interventions. And we're going to go on to describe that in a bit more detail on one of the following slides. But yeah, Stacey and I have come together from quite different disciplines through a shared interest around death and end of life, and how our different disciplines and backgrounds can kind of contribute to each other and inform and broaden the scope of what the work we're doing.
So I will talk about a couple of examples in design and then pass to Collie again. So the first one that's really interesting for me is the IDEO Redesigning Death in 2015, where they talked about the mobile landing page for the Zen Hospice project, and talking about this dying happens to all of us. So this kind of inclusiveness of bringing the person visiting the patient into the dialogue with death and dying, and thinking about the way that the visual color palette, the use of typography, the use of communication hit the right note with people coming in, so that it wasn't about it sort of being this very intense communication, but as I said, taking away that fictional separation between you as the person visiting and the person who you are going to visit, and sort of playing with that. And I think it's a really interesting visual language. The other example is the Rudian Buddhist temple in Japan. And this collection of Buddhas that you see in different colors actually represents each a different person who's died. And in Japan, traditionally, people would have a home shrine, but in a kind of aging generation in Japan, more and more people are dying without next of kin or without relatives to keep those ashes safe and to keep performing the rituals. And therefore, they've created these almost necropolis kind of scenario here, where there's a community of the dead that comes together and sits together. And as family members come to visit, they use a cue card to come in the door, and everything else goes dark, and only the person that they've come to visit is showing. And people have talked about the experience of being buried there as being something really positive, where they feel like they won't be lonely in death. So we're really interested in, again, these narrative structures and these words that people use to describe the rituals at the end of life, but also the kind of post-death, our continuation after death, essentially. And particularly in that medical scientific narrative, you know, what happens to our tissue after we die, and where does our tissue go to, and how does it contribute, and how does it become part of a collective whole?
Okay, so our commission is around embodying normality, and we want to explore what is normal for our bodies after death and how tissue donation or body donation kind of impacts or affects this. So we've drawn here on the 1980s film Threshold, which explores the idea of a mechanical heart replacement and the impact that by implanting something like this in the body, the effect that this can have on the individual. And the patient in this film has concerns about what having this medical device will mean for her as a person, and has to be repeatedly reassured that she will still be the same person following the implantation. And whilst it's a miracle in saving her life, it's not going to change kind of the essence of her, which links into my previous research, which has explored the impacts of individuals living with cardiac devices. So I've worked with patients who have been given implantable cardiac defibrillators, which deliver shocks to prevent you from having a dangerous rhythm that could cause a cardiac arrest, and patients who have been fitted with ventricular assist devices, which are pumps that keep failing hearts going until a patient could have a heart transplant. My work explored the impact of living with these devices on individuals' kind of daily life, how it impacted how they felt within themselves and their identity, how it shaped how they kind of move around their homes and in daily life and daily activities that we kind of normally might take for granted, and how it changed their kind of sense of their body and identity and the impact that it had on them. Drawing on some of these issues of whether by increasingly accepting new devices and replacements into our bodies, whether we're moving away from kind of the traditional sense of humanity towards more of this like idea of becoming cyborgs and having replaceable parts. So Stacey, could I get you to move to the next slide? Thank you. Both Stacey and I have done significant work with local community groups and organisations around Newcastle and the North East. As Stacey mentioned earlier, she's done a lot of work with Newcastle libraries with her Love After Death work. Much of mine, because I come from a medical sociology background, has been focused around healthcare and experiences as a patient rather than kind of a member of the community around death and dying, and also on the perspectives of clinicians. We've also got strong links with other institutions locally, such as the National Innovation Centre for Ageing and Newcastle University. And we want to draw on all these different community groups and organisations as part of our engagement work, so we can have as broad a range of perceptions and experiences of the issue of body and tissue donation as possible. Including, as I've put here, the Newcastle University medical students who are essentially recipients potentially of some of this donated tissue or bodies that they use as part of their education, and we want to look at how they then respond to that tissue and how they orientate towards it. Next slide, please.
So one of the ways that we're interested in engaging with communities and people, particularly in this situation of COVID where we can't run traditional design workshops, is through post-packs and then potentially virtual workshops that are based with it on the post-packs. So the post-packs would include some kind of interesting and sort of, I guess, supposed to be sort of fun activities for people to fill out. So we've got a series of bodies here that are sort of folded. They will be cut out kind of in laser cut with questions on them to stimulate people to think about, you know, what their family networks look like, what they want, what data they're leaving behind, what kind of bio or body data they'd be willing to share, you know, what their relationship is to the science and the data. And then also working with other kinds of a little sort of petri dish, which includes more of the people's reflections on what their relationship is to the scientific advancement, how they think about cells, how they think about their body being made of tissue, and these kinds of questions around that. So thinking about the kind of identity questions and the kind of scientific advancement questions, and then looking for people also to give us kind of emotions or feeling-based words that will help to shape the visual aesthetics and the visual language that we use, along with the kind of color and color palette. And finally, I'll let Holly do the call to action. We have this.
And our last slide basically is what we want from you as HCA members. We would like to invite you to take part in some interviews with us where we want to explore the experiences of those who are currently working with donated bodies and tissue, because we want to gain an understanding of what tissue is being used, what for and by who, some of the processes and rituals that surround that use of tissue, the rituals that surround the donation itself, and then the process of storing it and its use by research. And we're also very keen to explore some of the language that researchers use when talking about body and tissue donation. For example, does this follow the kind of organ donation rhetoric of it being a gift that's given by the person donating, or is there a different kind of language and lexicon that surrounds this type of donation? And finally, we want to explore some issues surrounding identity and ownership of the donated tissue or body. Does this change? Does it belong to then researchers or somebody else? And we're going to use the findings from these interviews as prompts in some of the design activities, as Stacey has discussed, to kind of facilitate a discussion with members of the wider public around tissue donation and how it is used.
I'm so impressed with all of you speakers, like totally ending on like bang on
Exactly.
time. So impressive, honestly. A brilliant call for action. So we have a couple of questions, but I'm going to do a live poll to keep you guys engaged. So Charlotte is going to share her screen for the next polling question, which is, have you collaborated with artists before? It's quite exciting seeing this live. So we've got a number of, we've got a number of people who have, and then a number of people who haven't. It seems to be fairly evenly split, which is really interesting. Okay, fantastic. So 60-40. So we'll go on to the Q&A. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes, and then we're going to take a break because I'm conscious that we're in a Zoom session and we can all get quite zoomed out if we don't take regular screen breaks. So we're going to chat until about 3:20 and then take 10 minutes, if that's okay. So our first question that we've got here, and please do keep adding to them. What do you feel about taboos in a health setting regarding depiction that are considered too biological? For example, cellular forms. Stacey and Holly, it'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is something that me and Holly actually talked quite a bit about when we were beginning to form the concept of the commission, and really considering how the public would feel about that. And obviously we had the example of the woman who wants to donate her body and have it all cut up, and but for most people those kinds of narratives are a bit far away from them. And I think there are they kind of settle somewhere in the middle. Like there's I guess a group of people who'd be interested in, for example, the Gunther von Haring sort of body worlds exhibition, and would be interested in seeing their body in that context, and other people who are really interested in the idea of medical body donation and would be interested in giving that to students over for education. But I'm not sure, I don't know how people feel in regard to understanding the body in a cellular context. And I think that's something I think both of us, I think Holly can speak as well to that, but that we'd be really keen to find out through the interviews and through talking to people of just how cellular we can go with the actual installation and with people's experience of that. Because we want to use the installation for people to kind of think about donating their body as a virtual form, as a virtual avatar into a kind of new collective whole. And that's the concept for the installation that we'll be working on.
Yeah, I would agree with Stacey. I feel that there's probably a degree of more comfort kind of talking about the body in terms of like whole organs and things like that, because there is more of a widely discussed narrative around organ donation. But it's something we'd be really keen to explore, is the understanding of kind of the body on a cellular level and what that is with the general public, whether and how we can kind of phrase that in a way to make it more accessible, to kind of open up this idea of tissue donation to more people in a way that they can kind of understand and engage with.
Amazing, thank you. I'm wondering if there's any feedback from the HCA community that are joining us today. Is there anyone who'd like to make a point or ask a question?
There seems to be one in the chat. I don't know.
Yes, there is. So we have got Christos. To me, cellular is less recognisable and might be more acceptable. I personally found the whole body exhibition disconcerting, and I'm a doctor, which is a really valid point.
Sorry, Susie.
I'm just saying that we've got another question having popped up in the Q&A, which asks, are you considering whether people consider that the donation they can make can be genetically linked to living relatives, and any attitudes around that?
I've explored some previous literature which has kind of suggested that when looking at it in terms of whether the reciprocity of the donation, so if you have maybe a specific condition or you belong to a specific disease group, individuals like that might be more keen to donate potentially because there is that perceived reciprocity, not for them, but for people like them. Whereas if you're looking at kind of healthy tissue donation, there's not that same kind of two-way exchange because it's not as easily identifiable who might benefit from it, if that answers your question at all.
I guess also from the data side, if that's more linked to the idea of the data being recognizable, like the DNA and that kind of side of things. I'm not sure if that's where the question was going to. I think it's interesting, our relationship to data and the way we kind of give it away. That's what I was kind of alluding to in the presentation, that we kind of almost don't think about it, even to the point where fingerprints, which are now being used quite often to unlock mobile phones and do lots of password protection, are actually being obviously left everywhere. But even to the point where the police in some countries define it as abandoned DNA, because you leave it around everywhere and you don't have an ownership of it, so it doesn't fall under any data privacy laws. And the fact that people are very, very happy to kind of spit in a bottle and send it for genetic analysis. So the kind of differences between something being used for a medical, scientific, very ethically rigorous and careful process, as opposed to being used for, you know, someone's pleasure of understanding their ancestry.
Really good. We have a final question that's quite gnarly. How are discussions or feelings of family members taken into account when individuals' own choices of donation to art or science or art science doesn't fit with family values?
Really, really important question. Something that I've been, I think, tackling possibly in all my work so far. And I think it simply causes whatever it is you decide to do with your body at the end of life, whether that's not honoring a family tradition of sending your body back to Nigeria because the community wants to have it and you want to have it instead, whether that's a choice of, you know, being a kind of having a celebration that's non-religious, or, you know, being trans, denamed, people who are trans being named by the wrong gender or the wrong name after death. I think these things are always very thorny around personal choice versus family values. So I think that definitely those things will come up. And from my part, I've always stuck more to the individual choice, simply because it's in the sense of engaging with the public. I find it much easier to engage with people and understand what their individual perspective and choices in that, and to understand their relationship then to the family and how they might want to engage with that. But I think there's a much wider research question around the kind of family values and how we help people to understand and communicate what ritual they want to the wider family groups.
Absolutely, and as Krishna has just highlighted in the chat, the Zoom chat to everybody, obviously in organ and tissue donation, the kind of the families are obviously need to provide consent as much as the individual, which is a really important point.